Here we go. We are live here on episode 6 of the MMA Debate Show. You should know the name of my own show. Joined here by a very special guest who had a big week covering UFC 237. It is, of course, Aaron Bronsteter. Thanks so much for joining me, man. How are you?
My pleasure, Lucas. Yeah, happy to join you. I'm doing great.
I really appreciate it. Listen, let the people know, where can we find you on social media, and where do you currently work in the MMA space?
So on Twitter, it's at Aaron Bronsteter. That's Bronsteter. I probably should have put my full name when I logged onto this broadcast to help you folks. But I'm sure you can find me, or if you follow Lucas on social media, which I imagine you do, he'll probably tag me in something or other. And I work at TSN, which is basically Canada's ESPN affiliate, largest and most watched sports network in Canada.
A little bit of the bragging rights right there. I assume you're joining us live from the TSN offices.
That's right. Yeah, I don't have fluorescent lights in my house, thankfully. So I am joining you from our offices here, yes, in TSN.
All right, so let's get into it. We have a bunch of good topics. We're going to talk about Jon Jones, obviously. Lots of good stuff going on with him. We're going to talk a little bit about everything. First things first, I want to start with Chris Weidman. I believe he announced yesterday with MMA Junkie that reported it, I believe, saying he wanted to drop back down to 185, saying he was done at 205. What's your take on this move from Chris Weidman? Is this the right move? Is this what you'd recommend? What are your thoughts on Chris Weidman?
Well, I think he saw what 205 was all about when he faced Dominic Reyes. And I think he realizes that at 185, he does have a decent size advantage over a lot of the people in the division. I think it's the right move for him, if he thinks it's the right move for him, because he knows what it's like to be in there at 205 versus at 185. And I'm sure that he's probably at the same fighting weight regardless. Like, I'm sure that when he's fighting at 185, he probably gets up to over 200. And then when he was at 205, he's probably in like the 215 range. So maybe a little bit lighter at the middleweight. But, I think that the time for him to move to light heavyweight was years ago. And because it didn't go that well now, I think that moving back to middleweight actually makes more sense. I think that had he gone to light heavyweight years earlier, perhaps he could have gotten a title shot because, middleweight suddenly became murderer's row. And he had to face the likes of Romero, Mousasi, etc. So I think that moving back down to middleweight right now when the division is starting to have a lot of new up-and-comers is a good timing on his part to perhaps get back into the title mix if he's able to.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take. I thought it was a little bit premature for him to drop back down to 185. I feel like 205, the first fight is Dominic Reyes, and we saw what he did to Jon Jones, so it was kind of it's tough to gauge where you are in the division when you face the number one contender and arguably maybe even the champion. So for me, I feel like it's a little bit too soon for him. I would have liked to see him take a couple more fights. And like you mentioned, we've been wanting to see him at 205 for years, and he does it now. And I feel like the division is a little bit more shallow, and that would have been the best time to get the title shot for him. So I feel like it's a little bit too early for him to drop back down. And I feel like, it's a little bit of the UFC's fault for not matchmaking him accordingly.
Well, they matchmake him so that he could be in contention for a title shot right away. They knew the name value behind Chris Weidman, former champion, and Jon Jones didn't really have a clear contender. So I thought that the matchmaking made sense. You kind of got a litmus test for where he would be in the division, and where it is below the number 2 ranked guy, like you mentioned. I mean, Dominic Reyes is, the number 1 contender really in the division. So I think that he felt if he couldn't get past Dominic Reyes, that getting a title shot at light heavyweight would be too far away. And I think honestly it's far away at middleweight too. So if this is what he wants to do, I don't think anybody can really tell him otherwise. I think that he probably feels more comfortable at 185. I too would have liked to see him maybe do one more at 205, maybe fight like a Jan Błachowicz or somebody along those lines, kind of to see if he could at least be in the middle tier of the division. But I just don't think that's what he wants to do. I think he still feels that he has the skills to be a champion in the UFC.
It is a little bit crazy because, like you mentioned, before the time to move up and sort of being in the middle of the division, I feel like either way, you're probably not getting that title shot. I mean, Dominic Reyes, that was his best opportunity. You mentioned the number 1 title fight. We saw how that ended. I mean, there were questions about his chin, his durability, and I feel like that wasn't going to get better at 205. But now back down at 185, I mean, Romero's fighting for the title. He lost to Yoel. I mean, he's lost so many names. I feel like either way, he's not really making – I don't want to say the right decision, but I feel like he's stuck either way. And I feel like maybe 205 with the fresher matchups and the fact that we know it's not as good of a division at 185. Maybe that was his best chance to get the title. But at the same time, like you mentioned, losing to Dominic Reyes, it just lets you know that you're not quite at that level. But I feel like he still could have gotten some decent wins. I mean, the question for me would have been, how did he feel physically at 205? Did he feel strong? Did he feel different? And I haven't gotten a chance to talk to him, so I don't know if he felt different physically. But that would have been something that I would have been curious about with his move up to 205.
He probably felt much better, but you know what felt a lot worse? Getting punched by
Yeah.
Dominic Reyes, a guy of that size. I think that's probably what was the deal breaker for him is, once, even watching James Krause this past weekend against Trevin Giles, when Trevin hit him, you could tell that it was a different weight class. You could tell that those shots were having more impact on him than, a Warley Alves or somebody at 170 or even at 155 where he fought prior to that. Those were big shots, and he was wearing them poorly. So I think that's something you have to always consider when someone's moving up a weight class. They're always going to feel healthier. Even look at Rockhold. I mean, Rockhold looked healthier. He said he had a great week. He barely had to cut any weight, but you feel what it is like to get hit by somebody that's 205, and that's what makes you throw the game plan out the window.
Yeah, I do agree with a lot of that because, like you mentioned, they move up, and while they get to put on an extra 20 pounds or whatever they choose to do, their opponent's already bigger and heavier, and you're going to feel that power. So, and especially for someone like Chris Weidman, he's always had those, he's had those durability questions recently. Luke Rockhold as well, like you mentioned. But for him at this point, I just don't really know what the right move is. I mean, not a lot of people can take Dominic Reyes' power, Volkanov's Demir, John Jones. I mean, obviously they're up there in the division. They can take it. Chris Weidman, for me, was definitely not someone that would have taken it based on his past couple of fights. But I feel like 205 really, for me, would have been the best place to try to become a contender because at 185, he's already got so many losses to all the people that are already at the top of the division.
Well, not really, though, because if you look at his losses at 185, like, who really is there? Romero's not going to be around for a while. Mousasi's at Bellator now. Jacare, I think, is back at 185, so you can put that one in there for sure. So I don't know. I mean, the division is starting to empty out a little bit. That being said, I do think that at 205, there are less contenders ahead of him. And with his wrestling ability at 205, I think that you can see the kind of strength that he would have when it came to the grappling against a lot of those fighters. But even at the light heavyweight division, people are becoming more and more well-rounded. I think that this weekend's fight is a good example of that. You've got Błachowicz and Corey Anderson, very well-rounded fighters. Reyes, very well-rounded fighter, good in all areas. So those kind of fighters didn't really exist in light heavyweight in the last couple of years. And that's why the timing for him to move to 205 probably would have been better years ago rather than now.
So what's the final takeaway? Is 185 the right move to go for you? Just like the final thing, should it have been 205, or is 185 for you just like really the correct place for him at this point?
I just think he needs to come to terms with whether or not he's okay with being a gatekeeper, because if he wants to be more than a gatekeeper, he's going to have to beat top-tier opponents. I think he feels he has a better chance of beating the top-tier opponents at middleweight than he does at light heavyweight, and I guess time will tell whether or not that's true. He has a win over Gastelum. Gastelum was a round away from becoming the interim champion and potentially beating Robert Whittaker and becoming the champion. So, I mean, listen, Weidman, I think, has probably more size than a lot of people at 185, and maybe he feels that that's a better asset than fighting bigger guys at 205.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I'm going to have to stick with 205 for me, but the biggest thing for me is that in order for him to be a contender and get a title shot, I'm just not sure where he goes at this point in his career, and that for me is a little bit disappointing considering just how good he was coming off that Vitor Belfort win. So it's disappointing, but contrary to you, I'm going to have to say 205. So
Fair
listen,
enough.
To move on, we have John Jones and Reyes. Before we get into who won, before we get into all that, coming into the fight, the questions were, is Dominic Reyes good enough to challenge John Jones? Is John Jones declining? Is he, questions about John and everything. What's your takeaway from this fight? Did we see John Jones declining, or is this a case of Reyes is better? What was your takeaway when you got finished watching that fight?
Well, my takeaway is that John Jones has always been at the top of the division because he was so much better at doing everything than anybody else. This was a specialist division. Look at who he beat. He beat Rampage. He beat Lyoto Machida. Rashad Evans to an extent, although I think Rashad Evans was somewhat well-rounded. Those were fighters that were from a previous generation. Even the Vitor Belforts, Chael Sonnens of the world, the guys that he's beaten are that's a previous generation of fighter. This is only the second time that John Jones has fought somebody younger than him in his entire MMA career. So when you look at it that way, you have to remember that the game is catching up. Everybody at light heavyweight that's like a Dominic Reyes, that's newer to the division, newer to the sport, they're all training every day to fight John Jones. Whereas John Jones was fighting to beat all these other guys that were one-dimensional guys. So I just think that the division is starting to just catch up with John Jones. I still think that John Jones is the greatest of all time. But I think that when you look at this particular division, you're seeing a lot more well-rounded fighters. I thought that Reyes, if you would listen to my podcast 2 weeks ago, we do our picks based on, I guess, the lines. And I picked Dominic Reyes. I thought that Dominic Reyes at plus 340, 350 was a good line in terms of value. And I think that while he did lose, and, losing is always the wrong side. I do think that I had a good point, and that a lot of the points that myself and Robin Black also brought up when we were talking about can Reyes beat Jones, a lot of the things that we said would be crucial to him beating Jones happened in that fight. A lot of good combos, a lot of good footwork, always moving, not those kind of skills, the leg kicks, all of those things kind of translated and gave John Jones difficulty. So my takeaway is that John Jones should stay at light heavyweight for the foreseeable future. I want to see him get challenged by guys like Reyes. I think Corey Anderson, another very well-rounded fighter, we'll see if he gets the job done this weekend. But I think that the division is starting to catch up with John Jones. I don't think John Jones is getting worse. I just think everybody else is getting better.
My first takeaway after the fight, it reminded me a little bit of LeBron James, where people talk about LeBron and they're saying he's not in his prime anymore. And yet LeBron not being in his prime is still that much better than everybody else. And I think that kind of applies for John Jones as well. I don't feel like he's quite in his prime anymore. And yet he's still that much better than everybody else. The biggest takeaway for me is not so much John Jones' decline, although I feel like he's declining a little bit. For me, this was just how good Dominic Reyes looked out there. I mean, just from the opening couple of seconds, you saw he really put the pressure on John, and John's face kind of told you that he was surprised at the pressure. So I feel like Dominic Reyes came in there with a really good game plan. I think, you mentioned that he's younger than him. He had like I said, a very good game plan, but he also matched up really well for someone trying to beat John Jones. I mean, we've seen him struggle with guys that can match that height. I mean, OSP, and you look at it and you're like, come on, OSP, but 6'4", and John Jones didn't give us a great performance. Alexander Gustafsson, 6'5", Dominic Reyes goes out there 6'4". So physically, he had the gifts to sort of give John Jones a challenge. But for me, his team, they really did this great job of putting it on John Jones, and we saw it pay dividends in the opening rounds. Judges aside and everything, I think he came out there with a really good game plan. Physically, I'd say he's in the prime of his life. And I know the joke coming in on his athleticism was like, oh, the baseball player and all that stuff. But I think we did see some athleticism, and he looked really good out there. So my takeaway is, man, Dominic Reyes looked really great, but I think John Jones is regressing just a little bit.
Yeah, I think you can make that conclusion based on the last three fights that Jones has had. They just haven't been impressive. Whether or not that means he's regressing or the rest of the division's getting better, or he's just not getting up to these fights as much as he used to, it's really anyone's guess. But the creativity that we've seen from John Jones over the year, I don't think was on display in this fight. I think that he was just working to his strengths. I think that he was doing the things that he needed to do to stay in the fight, and ultimately ended up winning the fight on the scorecards. Now, I didn't agree with the scorecards, but I do think that it was a very close fight. Certainly not a robbery by any means. I think people that are calling it a robbery don't really know what a robbery is in terms of MMA. But to me, I think that the big takeaway also from this fight is that if the UFC stay true to their word and make the fights that people want to see, they need to make the rematch next. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions here. People see that the Texas Commission's judges were terrible all night. So who's to say that they weren't terrible in that main event? Who's to say that, if you polled every MMA fan that watched that fight, or, everybody that watched that fight that knows what they're talking about, what percentage do you think would have said Dominic Reyes won the first three rounds? I think you're talking 60 to 70% of the people. Yeah. So if that's the public perception, and the UFC purports to always book the fight that the people want to see, then book the fight that people want to see. I think that the Jones rematch should be next. I think that Jones should stick around at light heavyweight. I don't think there's, people talk about heavyweight for John Jones. Put yourself in John Jones's shoes. What's the upside of moving to heavyweight? People already consider him the best ever. He's going to have to face these behemoths that he's not used to facing. You talk about size being an issue for him. Look at the height of a lot of these guys that he's beaten at light heavyweight. They're much shorter than he is, much stockier than he is. He's not going to get that at heavyweight. So I think that we have to keep that all in mind when it comes to John Jones and his future. But to me, that Reyes rematch has to be next.
Yeah, you mentioned the heavyweight, and I talked about this on the last show a little bit. I wanted him to stay at 205 even before this Dominic Reyes fight. And, people were trying to hype it up by saying, oh, what about Francis Ngannou versus John Jones? But I'm pretty sure at this point you could sell Francis Ngannou against just about anybody. You could bring out a horse out there and people would be hyped to watch it. So I don't agree with that argument. But like you mentioned, the height and everything. I mean, I mentioned Francis, 6'4". Ben Rothwell's throwing a name out there, 6'4" as well. I mean, these guys are big. And if you struggle with size, then you're going to find out real quick just how big these guys are. Dominic Reyes, he hits hard. We saw it on Jones. Thought he took the shots well. Usually when guys are starting to decline, especially physically, they have trouble taking those shots. And John Jones has great defense. Took a really big uppercut. We saw him take it well. My question for him at this point is, what's his mentality? With Anthony Smith and Thiago Santos, people are saying, oh, he's not motivated. He's not taking these guys seriously. Maybe considering their time at 185, I could understand it. But for me, if you're not going to take Dominic Reyes seriously, and we saw what he was doing to guys, then who are you going to take seriously at this point? So I have big questions on his mentality at this point. And you mentioned the creativity. It does feel like it's been different for him. And, there's a lot of people making arguments about USADA and stuff, whether they have a point or not. But part of that is because we feel like we're watching a different John Jones since he made that big comeback.
Well, I think that the saying that he, didn't get up for this fight, for example, or didn't take Dominic Reyes seriously, I think that's wrong. I think he did take Dominic Reyes seriously. I just think Dominic Reyes is that good. I think that Dominic Reyes, he basically threw the kitchen sink at John early, and he won those early rounds. Then he ran out of steam. I think that's all there is to it. I think that if you watch Jones versus Gustafsson, that comeback fight, like he looked phenomenal against Gustafsson in that fight. The Smith and the Santos fight, I can understand him not getting up for those. Those are middleweights. No disrespect to those guys because Anthony Smith is a killer. And Anthony Smith, I think, can beat most of the guys in the light heavyweight division. Maheta's a great fighter too, and he was knocking guys out left and right, including Anthony Smith. So, of course, that was before they both moved up to light heavyweight. But regardless of that, like, Reyes, just think is a better fighter than those guys, and I think that John Jones was taking it seriously. John Jones was working really hard to get up for this fight. He was building beef between them. He wanted to get emotionally invested, and I think he was. And I think he did that. It was smart that he did that because Dominic Reyes is that good. And I think that if there is a rematch, that will answer some major questions regarding John Jones. Because if John Jones can't get up for a rematch against the guy that almost beat him, I don't know what he's going to get up for. But Reyes looks like the real deal, man. And I think that rematch is one to make, and I'd like to see it right away, like I mentioned.
All right, let's move on a little bit. We talked about what's next kind of for John Jones, so that's why I want to move into this topic specifically. People are talking about what's next for John, what's next for Reyes, rematch. What's next for John Jones, what's next for Reyes, even though you touched on it a little bit?
I think it should be the rematch. I mean, if it's up to me, that's what I think should be next. If you're going to tell me that they have to be matched up with different opponents, that makes it a little bit tougher because I'd probably do Reyes versus the winner of Johnny Walker and who's Walker fighting again? Do you remember offhand?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I don't remember.
Yeah. If Johnny Walker wins, I'd like to see Reyes fight Johnny Walker.
Oh, is it Krylov? Is it Krylov?
Nikita Krylov, yeah. I don't know if Krylov should fight Reyes next, but if Johnny Walker beats Krylov, I think Walker versus Reyes would be a lot of fun. And then for John Jones, I think he would fight the winner of Anderson versus Blachowicz. I think that would be the next best fight for him. But again, I don't think either of those fights even holds a candle to what a rematch would be like. I'm sorry to Corey Anderson and to Blachowicz. They both have earned a title shot. They're both really good fighters. They're both on a roll right now. So I feel bad saying that I would give Reyes the shot, but we've seen what Reyes can do against Jones, and I think that we have a lot of unanswered questions here.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think for me, the rematch should be next. And I don't believe Dana White when he says after the event there's going to be a rematch. I think we can count the countless times, yeah, rematch, and then nothing happens. So, but I do kind of hope for a rematch this time with a competent commission, maybe people that know what they're watching. That would be great. I think a rematch is next. If a rematch isn't next, I was thinking about this a little bit, maybe Reyes versus Thiago Santos, and then the winner can get the rematch that people have been arguing about. I feel like that will make a lot of sense. And then, John Jones, obviously, the winner of Anderson Blachowicz, but I think it's up to Anderson and Blachowicz. What kind of fight are they going to give us this upcoming weekend? If it's like their first fight, which was very dominant for Corey, but, it was honestly a drag to sit through. If they can give us a super entertaining fight, a great performance from whoever wins it, it's going to be tough to not make that fight next. But if it ends up being, a 5-round and kind of lackluster and everything, it's going to be a lot easier to give Dominic Reyes the title shot. So for me, I would like to see Reyes next. I feel like there's so many questions, and now it's gained some steam. I think people want to see that now, and people tend to sleep on these John Jones fights a little bit because they're expecting, he's going to go out there, he's going to dominate, he's John. Now there's real intrigue in this one. So I feel like for the UFC and for the fighters, it makes sense to run it back. If they don't, John versus the winner of Anderson Blachowicz, and then Thiago Santos versus Dominic Reyes for me.
Yeah, I think that the Santos fight makes sense, except the problem is it would have to be really late in the year because Santos is still rehabbing his injuries. So
right.
That's why Walker came to mind. But I think Santos versus Reyes would be a lot of fun.
For sure. Let's talk about the decision a little bit. I feel like we've circled around it a little bit, but let's get into it. You're watching the fight. Did you watch the fight more than once, or did you watch it just on the night?
I've only been able to watch it once.
All right, so
on the night, yeah.
Yeah, so me too. So what was your takeaway when you finished the fight? Before they announced the judge's decision, who did you have winning, and what rounds did you have him winning?
Well, when I watch a John Jones fight or any other dominant athlete, Nunes or whatever, I always try to take the fact that they're John Jones or Amanda Nunes out of it. I try to disregard the crowd going crazy every time that their opponent lands, and it's difficult to do. And that's why these judges, while we rip them, they do have a very tough task to ignore that. And I think that they did ignore that, and that's why John Jones got the win in their eyes. I don't know if they were doing it to overcorrect the steering wheel, but I think that personally, I had rounds 1 through 3 for Reyes, and I can explain why. I mean, I thought the first round was a slam dunk for Reyes. The second round, people seem to think was a lot closer, but if you look at who landed the more effective strikes, I think it was Reyes. John made him miss a lot, but I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, Reyes landed 50% more strikes, and I thought he landed better strikes. And the fight took place entirely on the feet in the second round. So, when you look at those numbers and you look at the actual power of the strikes themselves, I think that you have to give Reyes that round. The third round I thought was a lot closer. I gave it to Reyes. I thought that Jones was pressuring a lot more in that round, but you don't get points for pressuring on judges' scorecards. And I thought Reyes again landed the better strikes and landed the cleaner combos. And I thought that the last 45 seconds of that round was anybody's round to win. And I thought that Reyes did a little bit more at the end of the round to close it out. So that's why I gave him those 3 rounds. And 4 and 5, I think, were clear Jones rounds.
It's interesting you mentioned, going into the fight, watching an athlete, the greatness, stuff like that. Because I feel like we do watch those fights differently. I feel like we almost kind of see that fighter as already having won the fight. And then, it's up to the challenger to make us change our minds. And, Dominic Reyes, like I mentioned, came out there with the perfect game plan. I mean, round 1, it looked like he'd shocked John, putting on that pressure, landing the good strikes. I feel like he kept that momentum going round 2, round 3. I mean, you touched on a lot of what I agree on. So for me, it was the first 3 rounds, Dominic Reyes. And I'm shocked as I'm watching it because I'm thinking, wow, I mean, this might be the night that we watch John lose it, and it's not going to be a fluke knockout. It's not going to be a submission we get caught. I mean, this is a legit guy came out there, had the better game plan. He was ready. Round 4 and 5 were for John, and what I think is ridiculous is the people saying if you win 4 and 5 because you were winning as the fight was ending, you should win it. I don't understand that. Joe Rogan talked about it on his podcast a little bit, and obviously this wasn't his take. He was like, if this was a school fight, whoever's winning as the fight's ending, great. But it's a fight in the octagon. It's a fight in the cage, and if you lose 3-2, you lose 3-2, and maybe that's not the way people wanted to see John lose. Maybe they wanted, like a real resounding, like, oh, all right, it's Reyes for sure, but. For me, it was Reyes, and it was kind of weird watching it. It was a little bit surreal because you feel like John Jones didn't kick things into gear, like almost he was holding back or he was maybe surprised. And I feel like Reyes kind of told us going into the fight, he's just a man, and, I'm not going to let him intimidate me and stuff like that. And I feel like that's exactly what we saw the first 3 rounds, and he did a great job. And even 4 and 5, he's still giving it to him, but you can tell the gas tank wasn't quite the same. And, but for me, it was Reyes, and it was definitely weird watching John, not do as well and, lose those first 3 rounds.
Yeah, for sure. And I had a feeling all week going in that Reyes was going to win. We're going to have a new champion. Like, for whatever reason, I just had this intuition about it. Then as it was happening, I was like, okay, this fight's going like I thought it would. I thought that Reyes was going to have this kind of success. And then as he started to slow down, it's like, okay, well, this guy's going to need to improve his gas tank if he wants to be a champion in this division. But I thought that was also a product of him just really being relentless in the first and second. I think he must have thought he was going to put John away, that his power was going to be able to put him out. It wasn't, and I think that's why he lost those last 2 rounds. But again, like you mentioned, it doesn't matter if it's a championship fight, who the champion is. It doesn't matter how you finish the last 2 rounds. It just doesn't matter. Each round needs to be scored individually. It doesn't matter who the champion is. You score the rounds individually. Whoever wins the most rounds wins the fight. That's just how the sport works. So I think that people that are overthinking things and saying, oh, well, he's the champion, blah, 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 it's just irrelevant.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of bias. I mean, you're looking at John as dominant, and in a way, I think people almost don't want to see him lose. And and it's up to the judges really to just focus on the fight, focus on what they're watching, give us an honest scorecard, and that's why Twitter isn't scoring the fights. Although for this one, I feel like they did do better than the judges in this case. But yeah, I mean, Dominic Reyes, you touched on something interesting. Was going into the championship rounds. I mean, he gassed, and we've seen him have issues a little bit with his gas tank in the past. So it does make you worried if he becomes champion that maybe in the future he's going to have issues in the later rounds. But that's not the problem on the night. The problem on the night is, he's winning this fight when it mattered, and came out there with a very good game plan. It seems a little bit silly to me to think I'm going to knock John Jones out, considering how, good John's defense is, how durable he's looked. But yeah, for me, it was a really great game plan from Dominic Reyes.
Yeah, for sure. I do think that he probably thought he was going to put John away. I'm sure he thinks he can put anybody away. The only thing that he could have done better is just maintain his gas tank a little bit more. But I think he must have thought that it was going to go, that if it went 5 rounds, he was prepared for it. But until you get into those championship rounds in reality, which he never has, that's when you start to slow down and realize, okay, well, doing this against an actual human being rather than doing rounds in the gym is totally different because there's a lot of emotion involved. Whereas when you're doing it in the gym, there's just not a whole lot of emotion involved.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the next thing that goes with this fight. At first I wanted to get into, how can we fix MMA judging and stuff like that, but I feel like we're going too fast into it. First things first, is there a problem with judging in MMA?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a problem. There's definitely judges that are not qualified to judge the sport that are judging the sport. And the funny thing is, this guy, Joe Solis, is actually very qualified in terms of his actual martial arts qualifications and backgrounds. He's got a black belt in jiu-jitsu. He's a trainer and instructor. Like, this isn't the guy who's some regional boxing judge, we see that all the time in MMA. You see these regional boxing judges come in and judge fights and do a terrible, terrible job because they don't know what they're watching. Joe Solis knows what he's watching, and that's the part that's really alarming to me, that he can think that Krause lost the first round to Trevin Giles. Like, this guy knows MMA. He knows he's a jiu-jitsu black belt. You should understand that when Krause has his back for 4 minutes and he's almost choking him out, that he's going to win that round. And I know that he knows who Trevin Giles is because Trevin Giles is a Houston native, and so is Joe Solis. And it's not that big of a city, and not that big of an MMA space in the city. It's a big city, but in terms of MMA, there aren't a whole lot of gyms that put out good fighters, so they know each other. So obviously, he didn't have a case of mistaken identity, but I think that is a problem with judging, and I think that the scoring system itself is a flawed system for MMA. And I've said this for years. You've got a 10-point must system that's conducive to boxing, which is a 9 or 12 round sport, put into a 3-round sport. And you'll see, like, one example that I think that a 20-point must system would work. A 20-point must system or a decimal system, like where you have decimals, is if you look at Whitaker versus Romero. I think that Romero won that fight, the second fight. I think that Romero should have won that fight. The 2 rounds that Romero won were far more dominant than the rounds that Whitaker won, but they weren't necessarily dominant enough to be 10-8 rounds. But if you have a decimal system, you can give Whitaker 10 to 9.5 for one of the rounds, maybe 10-9 for one of the rounds if it's really definitively him that won the round, but with not a whole lot of damage done. But then you have a round where a lot of damage is done, and it's not necessarily 10-8. You can do 10-8.5, or in the case of a 20-point must system, you do 20-16. And then, of course, if it's I guess it would be 2017. And then, of course, if it's the equivalent of the 10-8, then it's a 2016 round. The reason I like the decimals is because you can keep it within the window of a 10-point must system. But honestly, the best reason that people have given me about not doing a decimal system is that the judges won't know how to do math with decimals. The commissions won't know, honestly, and I think it's a legitimate argument because
unfortunately,
these commissions drop the ball time and time again. So to do math with decimals or fractions or whatever, it's problematic for them, which I think is like, just get a calculator and figure it out. I mean, it's not rocket science. So I think that the 10-point must system must go. I don't think that it works for MMA, and I've said this for many years.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think there are a bunch of issues with judging in MMA. First of all, the biggest thing that always shocks me is when you see like a weird scorecard. People look into the referee a little bit and you find out like, oh, he hasn't judged an MMA fight in 3 years. And I think Solis, there was something like he hadn't judged the main event or championship fight since 2017 or something like that.
Well, it was UFC fights. I'm sure he does LFA fights and regional fights, but yeah, like nothing on the highest level.
Right. So it's always things like that where you hear where I think, and especially for fans that aren't, that knowledgeable on commissions and stuff, you trust these judges. You think of these guys as like highly qualified and they know what they're looking at. But it's always disappointing to me when you feel like just your average Joe on Twitter drinking a beer, watching the fight can score it better than some of these judges. And for me, that's
average Joe is better than Joe Solis is what you're saying?
Unfortunately, yes.
They're the better of the Joes?
There you go. Better of the Joe. But no, I mean, even Joe Solis, like, you make a mistake in a championship title fight. Okay, it can happen, but he made a mistake in the Giles fight, made a mistake, I believe, in the Ewell fight as well. And it's like there's 3 of them, and you keep making these mistakes. And I don't think you can just remove them mid-card, although, I'd like them to at least try.
Dana's done it before, but I think it's been in locales where the UFC kind of runs the commission if it's an international location. But yeah, I don't think that they can go to the Texas commission in between rounds and be like, don't let this guy judge the main event.
Right, for sure. So, but Joe Solis for me was like the guy that kind of made people realize, okay, there's an issue. That's 3 times in a row. There's a bunch that, well, 3 times in a row, 3 times tonight that we've seen a problem with him. And I think he was kind of the guy. I don't want to pin everything on him because there are others. What's her name? Adelaide Bird, who everybody's a huge fan of. She does great in boxing, great in MMA as well. There's a bunch of issues with individual judges. And the crazy thing about Solis, I think you posted it on Twitter, if I remember correctly, that he had been part of John McCarthy's certification course or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's crazy because you're like, wait a minute, this guy's doing all this stuff. He should know it, and he's scoring stuff weird. I mean, who can you trust at this point? So, and we'll get into how we can fix it. But for me, it's, first of all, there's an issue with the judges. You mentioned the 10-point must system. At some point, we have to accept that, we're not boxing. And MMA's gotten this sport that's big enough that we can step away from the boxing system and really, move on to a different sort of scoring criteria. And you see the weird stuff like cage control, octagon control, and that kind of threw some people off as they were scoring the fight with John Jones. And, maybe effective striking over effective grappling and just weird things like that, where you feel like somebody would have to sit down and try to fix something. But the biggest issue is the fact that every state has like different rules for MMA. And if we can't even agree on the rules, how are you going to try to change judging on the top of it? But for me, there's definitely a problem in MMA judging. And this night, it wasn't the first time we've seen something like this, but it definitely highlighted the fact there are issues and things that should be fixed.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Texas Commission seems to do this every time that there's an event held in this state. It seems like they really make you think about the qualifications of some of these judges. But I mean, they have to keep holding events in Texas. I mean, the 10% of the U.S. population lives in Texas. Right. So you can't just abandon the state like a lot of people are suggesting. Just punish the state and don't have events in Houston and Dallas. Well, it's just as much of a punishment as your promotion. You're ruling out one of the biggest states in terms of population in all of the U.S. So let's be realistic.
And it's not fair to the fans either.
Oh, for sure. The fans have nothing. They haven't done anything wrong. In fact, they've done something right. They've set a gate record for the Toyota Center.
Yeah, exactly. But the funny thing about it is, what did Derek Lewis tell us pre-fight? We're going to have some kind of weird judging, controversial thing. And what happens? Exactly that. So we know there's a stigma around
from Texas. He knows.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. So we know that there's this stigma in Texas, and we know that there are issues. So obviously it's not just Texas we have to fix. And even internationally, things get weird when you talk about commissions. I know here in France, for example, they're still trying to figure out their commission for MMA, and they're like, well, maybe we'll just hand it over to boxing. So things are weird internationally. Things are weird in the States as well. But it's definitely some things that have to be fixed.
Yeah, it's not uncommon that the boxing commissions end up regulating in a state or country.
Right.
So, I mean, people shouldn't be up in arms about that, but they certainly do need to get the right judges in place that know mixed martial arts.
And so here's the question. There's an issue. How do we fix it? You mentioned your 0.5 decimal system, which is definitely something interesting. But what are some things that we should kind of look into if we're going to try to fix MMA judging?
Well, I mean, the decimal point system won't fix judging. Judging is just like there are going to be bad judges. Right. I just think that the scoring system is flawed. That's a whole different story. In terms of the judging itself, though, I think you just need to make sure the UFC just need to vet the judges for main events, and so do the states. Like the states can't just keep putting in these regional judges because they have experience like judging LFA fights. It's just it's not realistic. And I listened to Andy Foster on Ariel's show yesterday, and he made some absolutely fantastic points about just how few really good judges and really good referees there are in the sport in the whole world. So, I mean, I know more training, somebody said to me, all these judges should have to take the John McCarthy course. And then I posted a picture of Solis, John McCarthy, and Jaron Villel who run the course. And even Jaron Villel isn't he's made a lot of mistakes. And he is like one of the guys that runs the referee course with John McCarthy. So, I mean, I don't know what you can do. Refereeing is a very, very difficult job. And judging is a difficult job because they consume the fight differently than you and I do. And that's the thing a lot of people need to remember. They're cage side, and unless they're watching on a monitor, they're not seeing the best angles. They're not seeing exactly where the damage is being done. Like, one thing I think would be beneficial is you get 3 soundproof rooms, and you put them in 3 soundproof rooms. You put headphones on them that are playing white noise or that they can't hear, like those earphones that block out sound, noise-proof headphones, and put them just in a room with a monitor and let them watch it the same way you and I do with no commentary to sway them. And I think maybe that makes it a little bit better and less distracting. You won't be able to see if a judge is on their phone during a fight or whatever, but you will be able to have a judge in an isolated area. You have them maybe type in their score at the end of the round, and it goes to the commission, and the commission tabulates it. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really old school ways of doing things. You're writing it by hand, and you're handing it to somebody, and they come over to the table. Why not just bring it into the next century and have a more automated system that's a little bit less, a little bit more foolproof.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Well, at this point, the way judging is, no idea is a bad idea. Fixing the scoring
Open
system
scoring is a bad idea.
Oh, and we'll talk about that. We'll go after the open scoring. Don't worry, it's on the list. But no,
I'm happy to hear that.
For sure. The thing for me about the judges is, the first thing I thought, just like everybody else, was, well, this guy needs to take Big John's course, somebody needs to train him. And then you found out they got trained. It's like, all right, so what now? It's like, he knows his stuff, and he's a black belt and all that stuff. What are you going to do about it? It's like, oh, okay, now we're talking. Soundproof Room is a great idea because, especially with the commentators, you feel like, how many times have we heard Joe Rogan when he was commentating Johnson versus Nurmagomedov? A lot of people were like, try to watch that one without sound and then tell me if you feel the same way. So it's definitely a great idea. I think more training does need to happen. Maybe not Big John's course, because obviously for Solis that's not enough. But it's also about finding more people that are willing to be judges. I think Luke Thomas was talking about it as well, and he was saying that it's tough for them to go out and find people that are willing to give up their Saturdays, some of them their Fridays, depending on the event. So for me, it's about trying to find more people, finding people that are qualified, but also not being afraid to let people go, like Solis after this one, or Bird and things like that. You got to let them go, and it's obviously up to the commission, but these people do have to be held more accountable.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, the commissions protect these guys. They protect the referees.
Right.
So if you have a round like Giles and Krause, which is a complete abomination of a scorecard, I think that the judge needs to put out a written statement as to why they thought that they won the round. Hold them accountable. Make them explain why James Krause lost that round to Trevin Giles, and have the public assess what their, have the commission assess what their explanation is, and have it be transparent to the public. Maybe we have to shame these people, because I just don't know what else you can do in these situations. Like we've discussed, Solis should, by all accounts, be like, he's also a referee. He knows what's going on in there. He's not some joker. Like he knows what he's watching. So like I just don't understand how he can judge a fight that way. And I mean, here's another thing. Trevin Giles is a Houston guy. He's from the city with Solis. You need to vet these guys for conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
Because why else would you give that guy that round? It's unfathomable. Like the Ewell scorecard 30-27 is a terrible scorecard. But at least you could probably go round by round and maybe explain why. Giles versus Krause is beyond explanation. It's honestly impossible to have thought that Giles won that round. It really is. So if there's a round like that, I think the UFC needs to be able to subpoena or send some sort of request to the commission to get a written explanation from that referee. That's, I think, the only way to hold these people accountable, because unless they can say, well, listen, I made a mistake, it should have gone the other way, then you have to overturn the decision to Krause, because Krause would have won the fight if you go the other way. The other thing that's crazy about that Krause and Giles fight is that judge scored the third round for Krause, which was an incredibly close round. So did he do that because he was like, I messed up on that first round, there's no way I could have given it to him, but I really want Trevin Giles to win, but now I have to make it look like I'm not biased? Like that's what that smells like to me. It smells suspicious that you have a referee that gives the first round to Giles and the third round to Krause, when the third round is a really close round and the first round is not close at all.
Yeah, definitely. The bias that you bring up is interesting because, a lot of people, they always talk about, wanting more fighters, in the media industry, in the judging and stuff like that. But the biggest thing with the fighters and the judging, I mean, Chris Lieben, for example, was saying that when he started getting into judging, he realized that, it was much more difficult than he realized. And he almost said, it turns out I didn't even know what I was looking at. But you mentioned the bias with Solis and Texas, Houston, all that stuff. But who's to say these fighters aren't going to be biased themselves? I mean, they're the ones training with these guys. There's a lot of guys that they know, especially you find out the network. So for me, the fighters are not necessarily the solution. They could be potentially, but I'm worried about that. But like you mentioned a little bit about Solis and how he's could be corrupt. It's worrying because if you can't trust these judges, then at this point, it's because the thing is
that he's corrupt. I wouldn't call him corrupt.
Right.
But I think that there could be a conflict of interest. That's all. Corruption is a lot deeper than having a conflict of interest. I don't think that he's being paid off or anything along those lines. But I do think that when you're in the city where you own a gym and you're training, you could also have a bias against a lot of fighters from a different gym. If you're at a rival gym and you don't like the coach there and they're getting better business than you, you could have a bias there too. That's what was it? I think Team Sarah Longo said that there was an issue that they had with Douglas Crosby, that Douglas Crosby was scoring fights against their gym because he had a vendetta against them for something that went back to prior years where there was some sort of falling out. That can't happen. Like, you need to be able to disclose whether you have any sort of conflict of interest going into a fight, because otherwise you just should not be judging it.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with a lot of that. It's the bias is something that we should definitely look into. And people have also mentioned, the post-fight press conferences, bringing the judges out to get grilled by the media. I think that's a little bit extreme. I don't think that's quite the right idea. But like you mentioned, being held accountable, maybe explain what you saw out there, explain your reasoning, give out a statement. These guys, they kind of give you these scorecards and then they go into hiding and you don't hear anything about it. Another thing that makes it a big deal is that it's, especially for the UFC, is the win bonuses. I mean, when one judge not being sure what he's looking at, or like you mentioned, could be biased potentially, and he gives you a round wrong, and you find out that, half your money, well, you're not going to get it because you lost, and it could potentially be a judge's fault. That's a big deal as well.
For sure. I mean, these are people's livelihoods at stake, absolutely. And also the reputation of gyms, you don't want to have your fighter lose fights that they shouldn't be losing.
All right, for sure. Let's move on to something else. Continuing with the judging, but it's something that I'm excited to talk about. I don't know if there's going to be much of a debate, but Kansas have announced they're going to be trying out the open scoring system to see how it goes. People have asked for it. People are against it. We've got all sorts of takes. Open scoring, what's your take on it?
Open scoring sucks. And anybody who watches combat sports should know this. But it seems like a lot of people in MMA that cover the sport don't watch kickboxing or don't watch boxing that have had open scoring in the past. Go watch Canelo versus Austin Trout. Austin Trout was incredibly competitive for that fight, but it was in San Antonio, Texas, which is near the Mexico border, and every round was going to Canelo. If you looked at media scores after that fight, people in the media were giving that fight to Trout, but it didn't matter because by the time that fight's over, all the energy is sucked out of the arena because they know how the fight's going to end. They've given six of the 6 rounds or whatever it is to Canelo. You have to go back and look what the scores were. And then it just sucks all the air out of the arena. And then in Glory, they do open scoring sometimes. And the people that are watching know that. I think in kickboxing, at least you can make an argument for it, because if you get a knockdown, it's basically a 10-8 round. You need a knockdown. You need to go for broke. But going for broke in kickboxing or boxing versus MMA is different. If you go for broke in MMA, you're going to get taken down and held there. And if you know you're up 2 rounds, you're going to fight very conservatively in the last round. I know people say, oh, but look at the flip side. They're going to fight aggressively. Well, if you fight aggressively in MMA, you're going to get taken down. And the person that's winning the fight is going to know in the back of their head that this guy knows they need to get a knockout. And then, especially if it's like a flyweight or a women's strawweight or a women's flyweight fight going into the 3rd round, if you know the score, you know how it's going to end for the most part. Because almost all the, a large percentage of those fights go the distance, especially once it enters the 3rd round. Right. So it sucks all the air out of the arena. And it also takes away from the fun of not knowing what's going to happen on the judges' scorecards, which is a big element of MMA that people love and that create the kind of debates that we're having today and create the kind of conversations that we've had since UFC 247. Because let me give you an example. Open scoring. John Jones versus Dominic Reyes. Entering the 5th round, the score would have been 39-37. 39. I'm so bad at this because it was 3-1 for Jones. So whatever that is, that's 39-37, I believe it is.
Something like that.
Going into the 5th round, and 38-38, 38-38. So at this point in time that Dominic Reyes is exhausted. He's probably not going to win the 5th round. So why even bother? Where's the excitement? The excitement just gets sucked right out of the arena. Because if Dominic Reyes went for broke in that 5th round, knowing that he was down on the cards, he would have gotten taken down at will and held there. That fight would have been, that round would have, because Dominic Reyes thought he was up on the cards, I think he was fighting a little bit more conservatively and trying to maintain his energy. But once you know what the outcome's going to be, it ruins the entire spontaneity of the sport. And I think that that's a very important part of this sport. And also, just go and look at examples of open scoring. It just doesn't work. It's not fun. It detracts from the experience of the viewer. And while this is a sport, it's also entertainment.
I agree with a lot of that. I hate the idea too. And like you mentioned, it takes away some of the excitement and stuff as you wait to hear the scoring and stuff. The biggest thing for me,
watch Invicta when it goes to the 3rd round and it's like 2018. Yeah. These are, again, women's divisions where there's almost never a finish in the 3rd round. It's going to be you're going to know the outcome of the fight pretty much, going into the 3rd round. Just watch it in action in Invicta. You'll see that it doesn't work. That's my opinion. But go ahead, Lucas. Sorry to cut you off.
No, but the thing for me is that, you hear coaches, you hear fighters talk about what are the number one thing for them is go out there and finish the fight. And the big argument I hear as well, if he knew he was down on the scorecards, he'd go out there and finish the fight. Shouldn't he be trying to finish the fight, before hearing the scorecards? And then Reyes, they're like, oh, things would have been different if Reyes knew he was down. No, Reyes
Yeah,
was
whatever. Different.
gassed.
He would have lost worse in the 5th round.
Yeah, and the thing is, Reyes, he's trying to knock out John Jones. Like, he's not like, oh, what, let me take it easy against the greatest of all time. It's, I'm currently in college right now, so and a lot of talk with the grades is always, the people that are trying to get just enough to pass and the people that try to go above and beyond. Do you really want to go out there and fight John Jones and do just enough to pass, take your foot off the gas, like, I did enough? Or are you going to go out there and you're going to try to beat him every single round, or you're going to try to knock him out? I mean, I don't see what it's going to change. You know that you're down and that you probably need to win that last round, but I don't see how things are going to be different at that point. And a big point you mentioned is it takes out the fun. I remember when I was first watching the sport and, you don't really understand how the scoring works and everything. And you're just sitting there waiting for the decision. You're like, oh, I'm not sure who won and stuff. If you take that away, what's the point? Even when Bruce Buffer does his and still or reads out the scorecards, what's the point? Mm-hmm. I mean, what's he going to do? Yeah, you already know what happened. Kind of makes me think of, I try to think of like maybe basketball or soccer, one of those sports where the scores at the end. What happens? It just ends, and then there you go. Nothing really happens. MMA, it's a show, and you put up the open scoring, and you already know what happens, and you're kind of like, yeah, okay. And especially those fighters that go into that last round, try to get that finish. Right, just duck your head down, take the guy down. A little bit of lay and pray, and then you're kind of disappointed because you're like, oh man, you feel like the guy should have gone for broke, and you almost feel cheated because you're like, man, this fighter on purpose didn't want to. I want to say finish the fight. And, the amount of guys that are going to coast in those last rounds is what's going to be super disappointing about open scoring. So I feel like the idea, the way people look at it, they're like, well, maybe if the fighters knew, it's different. But you have to remember that when you go back to your corner, your coaches are, well, usually the coaches are telling them if they're up or down. Like, they're not in complete shock, like, oh my God. The coaches are telling them what happened that last round. Hey man, you probably won it. Hey, you probably lost that one. You're going to need to go out there. But, I think open scoring is definitely unnecessary. And like you mentioned, we're going to find out at Invicta. I mean, usually not a lot of finishes. And you're going to find out real quick just how much the suspense is gone. And, hopefully they figure it out soon enough and they go ahead and fix that.
Yeah, and I spoke to James Krause this week, and I asked him, if you knew that one of the judges gave Giles a 10-9 after the first round, would it have had an impact on you in the corner? And he said, absolutely. He said it would have thrown him for a complete loop. It would have basically thrown off his entire his mindset going into the fight, because he would have been like, what else do I have to do to win a round against this guy? So that's another way of looking at it as well from the fighter's perspective. I'm sure some fighters would like to know what their score is at, but imagine if you're also a coach, like, you're going to flip out if you see that a judge has scored against your guy in a clear round. The judging is not going to get fixed with open scoring. We're just going to know when it's bad before the results are in. It's still going to be bad. It's going to be transparently bad.
Yeah, that's a great point you make. Something that I thought about too is, imagine these fighters that talk about being in the zone and, the only thing you hear is your heartbeat and like your opponent or something like that. If you get distracted from the scores and that drastically changes the fights, that takes away something from what we're watching. And it would definitely be disappointed, and like you mentioned, the coach loses concentration for a sec as he realizes his fighter loses. I mean, this is going to change a lot of things. And, I'm one of those people, I don't love change in sports like that. I enjoy the way the sport is and things. And I feel like open scoring would change a lot more than people realize. And especially a big component is, taking away these guys' concentrations. And maybe you see guys' mentality going into last round being drastically different. I don't want to say giving up, but you mentioned James Krause, where it's definitely you're a little bit discouraged because you're not sure what's going on and you're not as focused on the fight as you should be.
100%.
All right, we talked about open scoring, a great subject. We found out Bellator, they announced recently that the middleweight title is happening. It's going to be Douglas Lima versus Gegard Mousasi. What's your take on this move? Was this the right move for the title? Is it time they stop doing the super fights? What's your take on this from Bellator MMA?
I think it's fantastic, but I don't know why it's the co-main event to Nemkov and Bader. Like, I know you want to have the heavier weight classes as the main event, but I mean, what's going to be the more exciting? What would you rather be, watching Lima versus Mousasi, and then after that you're going to watch Bader versus Nemkov, or watching Bader versus Nemkov and then getting amped up for watching Lima versus Mousasi? That seems like a mistake to me. Maybe they'll change that, but I think it's fantastic. The middleweight division in Bellator has always been a bit of a dumpster fire. Think about it. For years and years and years, it was essentially terrible. Like, they had no depth. So now you're starting to get a little bit of depth, and they're giving Lima the opportunity to become a double champ, which is pretty cool. I mean, the thing about this fight is that Mousasi used to be a light heavyweight. And if you watch Mousasi versus Rory, he was so much bigger than Rory. And I fear that he's going to be much bigger than Lima and just be able to control this fight. But I feel for Rafael Lovato Jr. that he had to basically step away from the sport until he gets his health his health situation sorted out. But I think that the end product of it is good for Bellator to have these two face each other for the middleweight belt.
You mentioned Lovato. I'm glad he was able to step away as well. The biggest thing that made me happy about it is that he's not going to get pressured to go back out there. We know guys, they're like, it's probably nothing. And, people are going to put that pressure on him to go back. I'm just glad, unfortunately he loses the belt, but you know what? He gets to take that step back. And if he wants to come back, he can. And no one's putting that pressure on him. As for this fight, I love it. Matchmaking-wise, it's going to be great. I am worried a little bit about the size difference if Lima is as big as he needs to be, especially considering, Mousasi is a big fighter himself. Lima is 6'2", so, height-wise, it's good, but is he going to be strong enough? But, matchup-wise, it's great. And I think you're wrong about Ryan Bader. How many times are we going to watch those awesome fights against Phil Davis? I mean, are you not entertained by Ryan Bader?
I will say this, though. Vadim Nemkov is really sneaky good. Yeah. Like, that's a fun fight. So I'm looking forward to that because I think Nemkov, honestly, is the real deal. But the one big disappointing thing about Lima versus Mousasi is that there was that picture of Lima and Usman standing face-to-face that was taken over the weekend. That's sad. Why put a steak in front of a dog in a cage and get us all salivating, and then go in another direction? But whatever. I think that fight will never happen, unfortunately. Probably in all likelihood.
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about the matchup, and Bellator's like, well, I got something for you. It's like that's not the ex-UFC guy we wanted to see out there. I mean, it's good, but we could do a little bit better. The one thing that about this fight that it's not so much the fight, but it's Bellator. For me, they're doing too many champ super fights. I mean, I forgot who it was. Somebody put out a tweet telling us, what the divisions look like, and I think if Douglas Lima wins, there'll be 3 champions across I don't remember how many divisions. And for me, it's like and Bellator they don't do that many events, so it's like especially with the title. So if you start on top of it having one champion for this division, he defends his belt one division a year and stuff like that. For me, it's a little bit disappointing.
Yeah, but matchup, there's 7 men's divisions, and you'll have 3 champions taking up 6 of those divisions. That's a lot.
Yeah.
You're right. That's a very good point.
I mean, it's a little bit overboard. I like where your head's at. I like what you're doing. You're trying to put on these exciting fights, but at some point you have to keep things chugging along and moving. And I like the tournaments. They're doing things good. But let's come back to this Lima fight. I love the fight. I just hope that at the end of it, if Lima does win, they make him choose a division, especially because 170 things are happening in that division. I mean, and people are constantly forgetting the fights that happen. I saw people saying, "Oh, we need to see Larkin Lima as a fresh matchup." There's nothing fresh about that. We already saw it. But 170 is a division that's always moving, and you have to keep it moving. So for me, that's the most important thing. But matchup-wise, it's a great fight. And if Mousasi beats Douglas Lima as convincingly as did Rory, maybe it's time we stop feeding him welterweights. That would be the way to go.
And the timing's right here also because the tournament just ended in the last couple months. Right. So you've had all the different top welterweights kind of go against one another. It's good to hit the reset button a little bit by doing this fight, and then you can kind of pick up business and figure out who the next contender is at 170 in the meantime. I think that this is the right timing for this particular fight for sure.
So let's end it with this. What's your official prediction for this fight? I know it's a little bit tough, and maybe you thought about the matchup a little bit, but who do you have winning this one?
I think Mousasi will win. I think Mousasi will utilize his grappling, and because of the size disadvantage that Lima's in, I think that you'll be able to see Mousasi have a lot of success with the grappling. And even on the feet, I don't think he's going to be that outmatched against Lima. He might actually have even an advantage against Lima in terms of the power. So I think that Mousasi should be the favorite in this situation. I think he's going to win.
Mousasi as well. I think it's going to be interesting with Douglas Lima's leg kick, see if he could change the fight. But, man, Mousasi's great on the feet. He's great on the ground. I mean, for example, he's beaten someone like Thiago Santos, who's great on the feet, just like an example for sort of his striking. So I'm excited for it. But I have Mousasi. Wouldn't be surprised if he finished it, but wouldn't be surprised if he went the distance. But, yeah, for me, it's definitely Mousasi. Something else to talk about a little bit. People are asking what's next for Valentina Shevchenko at this point. People want to see her move up. People want to see her move down. People want to see her stay. What does Aaron want to see her do at this point? What's the right move for Valentina?
Well, first off, I don't think there's any evidence that she could move down. She's not just going to cut 10 pounds easily. But I do think that now's the time for Nunes versus Shevchenko 3. And I was saying it on Saturday, and everybody seemed to disagree with me. But what else is there? Let's just play, the process of elimination game. I think that unless you want to let Nunes wait until the summer and maybe face the face Felicia Spencer if she wins at the co-main event at the end of February and defend the featherweight title. There's not really a whole lot left for Amanda Nunes, especially at bantamweight. I mean, Ketlin Vieira just lost to Aldana. I don't think Nunes versus Aldana is a very juicy matchup. I mean, Nunes and Shevchenko are just running through their respective divisions. The last two fights were not blowouts. They were very, very close fights. Some people thought Valentina won both those fights. I'm not one of those people. I thought Nunes won both those fights. But be that as it may, when you have that kind of uncertainty and you have the two best women's mixed martial artists on the planet and they can fight each other, I think you make that fight happen. Like, why not? I mean, that's really my take. Is I just don't know. Like, are people going to be excited about Shevchenko versus Calderwood or Modafferi or Jennifer Maia? Not like. I mean, let's make a sellable fight here. While these two are still on their streaks, they're still at the very top of their games. They're considered to be the two top women's mixed martial artists in the world. Let's get the rubber match going on.
I think the tricky thing with Valentina is that you don't really know who's next for her, and I don't think you can really sell a challenger. I mean, sure, Roxanne Modafferi beat Macy Barber last time out. Okay, great, but how are you going to sell me that one? I mean, you saw what she did against Chukagian, who doesn't get finished. That's the problem, is that in her division, you don't know who you match her up with. The problem, though, for me with the Amanda fight is it's not an exciting fight like to actually watch. I think both fights they're competitive. Don't get me wrong, they're interesting, but it's not super entertaining. And I think that's where people struggle a little bit. It's not this super fun matchup. Legacy-wise, we're going to look back at these two women as well. Obviously, Amanda Nunes is considered the GOAT for many people. Even though we like throw that term around, Shevchenko is going to be looked at one of the best 125ers ever in the women's division. Legacy-wise, it's a great fight to put back, and especially considering the fact that it's a trilogy and a close one. But in terms of people actually wanting to see, I think people almost don't really have like a good option that they want to see for Valentina. So we saw the Nunes fight; it wasn't great. It's interesting, but not great. And then next in her division, there's really no one. I mean, go ahead and try to sell me a contender that might beat her. I mean, I don't think anybody can.
Yeah, I don't think anybody can either. And I don't even think that there's anybody that can even hang with them.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, Chukagian for me was like the answer of, she go to the distance and stuff. And then we saw her get finished and I was like, all right, well, if she can't do it, I'm not really sure who's next at this point.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's just nobody if Macy Barber would have beaten Modafferi, I think you could have maybe built something intriguing, but now she's injured and she lost. So, I mean, it's not going to be until next year at the earliest she can get a title shot, unless she somehow has a miraculously fast heel and is able to win 2 more fights by the end of the year.
All right, moving up 2 divisions. In the men's, we've got 145. People are talking about what's next for Alex Volkanovski, what's next for Max Holloway. A lot of people are saying that's the fight to make next. What's your take? Is Holloway Volkanovski next for featherweight?
Well, I asked Dana White about it, and it seems like that is going to be next. It's going to take place in June, and likely in Australia. But I do think that's the fight to make next. I think that Max Holloway.
Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Aaron, can you hear me?
Sorry, you got me back?
Yep, yeah, you're back.
Oh, did you hear what I said, or where did it cut off?
Pretty much right at the beginning.
Okay, well,
you explained that it was next in Australia and everything, and then it just kind of cut off.
I think if you look at how many fights in a row Holloway won at featherweight, I think it's just a no-brainer. You got to give this guy another opportunity. The fight went 5 rounds. He didn't get finished or anything along those lines. I don't think it was a controversial decision. I mean, I think that Volkanovski won that fight, but I think you've got to give Holloway an opportunity to prove that he can beat him. So I think you have to. I personally think you have to make that fight next. I think it's just Max Holloway's been such a good company guy. He takes 2-3 fights a year. He's been a winner for so long. Like, we need to see what he can do against Volkanovski.
I'd agree with you, but this is in 2015. We're in 2020. The champions rematching after they lose after a dominant stretch. It's not really happening anymore. For me, I think I'm tending to lean towards the Korean Zombie, and also because it's a fresh matchup. The Zombie is doing things right, going on Ariel's show, trying to market himself as the next challenger. For me, the biggest reason why I don't want to see this rematch is because I feel like the first fight was so decisive. We saw Max Holloway frustrated. We saw Volkanovski put up this great game plan, and for me, I'm just not convinced that we're going to see anything that different in the second fight. Obviously, I can be wrong. This is MMA, but for me, it just feels like almost too soon. Like, I'm not sure we're going to see anything new. Like, for me, Alex kind of proved it. I'd like to see both guys maybe take another fight or two. Definitely running back in the future, but for me, immediate rematch. I mean, it's happening. You talk to Dana, but for me, it's not really the move to go for next.
Yeah, I think it's kind of split. I think that a lot of people don't believe that it's the right fight to make next. I'm not of that opinion, but I can see why people would say that. I do think it was a fairly decisive fight. You could have possibly given Volkanovski all 5 rounds, but I think that you owe it to Max Holloway to at least give him the opportunity to show that it might have been a fluke. I don't think it was, but I mean, you got to give the guy the opportunity to try to win it back.
Yeah, I can get on board with that a little bit. I mean, you can sell it. Obviously, it's not like this crazy fight like the first one. It was for me, it was decisive, but I think it was close enough that you could potentially run it back. But for me, I just feel like a Korean Zombie just, for me, just a little bit above, even despite everything that Max has done in his title reign.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, but what in his last 3 fights, who's Zombie? So Zombie beat Frankie Edgar, who was leaving the division. And then the fight before that was at the Yair fight, or he had another win after the Yair fight, right?
I think he's like on a two fight winning streak or something like that. I don't remember who it was.
I'm trying to remember who he beat, but regardless of that, I think that was it Moicano that he beat. I can't remember.
Oh,
but,
I think it was Moicano.
Yeah.
I think it was in South Carolina or something.
Mm-hmm. But Yair hasn't even fought since that fight with Zombie. I don't think so. Oh no, he fought Jeremy Stevens, right? Was that Yair
right.
Stevens? Yeah, Yair beat he beat Jeremy Stevens. So why isn't Yair the guy then? Like, I mean, I don't know. I just think there are a lot of moving parts at 145 where I think the most qualified guy to fight for that belt right now is Holloway. But I can see why somebody would argue otherwise. Honestly, I think there are a lot of really good contenders. I think that's like 145. I think is the deepest division in the UFC right now. Look at Bandy Gay still not ranked. He's won 5 in a row.
Right.
Like, I mean, that's how strong this division is.
For sure. I can agree with a lot of that. And that's all the time we have today for episode 6. Aaron, I really appreciate you for joining me, man. Some really good stuff. Let the people know one more time, where can they find you on social media? And, let us know if you have any projects coming up with TSN or anything interesting you'd like to share.
So at Aaron Bronsteter, you can find me on Twitter. Any of those projects that I would promote, I'll be promoting on social media. And the TSN MMA show is my weekly podcast with Joe Valtellini, who is the former Glory welterweight champion and the voice of Glory. So check that out. A lot of good debate between Joe and I every week, and a lot of good guests as well. So and tsn.ca/UFC for all of our UFC coverage.
All right, there we go.